In a remote Appalachian hollow, a teenage girl gave birth to a child so deformed, neighbors swore it wasn't meant to survive. But the real horror wasn't the baby, it was that no one could say who the father was. Because in that house, every man was family. This is Hidden Docks, where America's buried histories are unearthed from church pews, grave markers, and whispered legends. Subscribe now and step with us into the shadows of the Forgotten Mountains, where bloodlines twist, and truth is stranger than folklore. In the early 1900s, the Appalachian Mountains were more than just rugged terrain. They were walls of stone and forest that sealed entire communities away from the world. Deep inside those ridges, where dirt roads ended and rivers twisted like veins, one family lived so far from society that even their names slipped from records. They existed in a shadowed world where bloodlines intertwined until they became indistinguishable, and tradition was not measured by law, but by survival. Neighbors spoke of them in half-whispers, never too loudly, as if the mountains themselves would carry the words back to the cabin. They were a clan that kept to themselves, refusing the watchful eyes of churches or schools. Generations had come and gone without leaving marks in ledgers or census files, and in that secrecy a girl was born, not to freedom but to a fate already decided by those who raised her. To outsiders, family meant protection, warmth, and love. But in that cabin, family meant something darker, something blurred. A daughter could also become a wife. A sister could become a mother. The roles overlapped, twisted until the language of kinship no longer made sense. What began as isolation turned into something much more sinister, the slow erosion of boundaries that most of the world considered unbreakable. The girl grew up watching her father and uncles live under the same roof, their lives bound tightly by necessity. But when her mother passed, some say from sickness, others from sheer exhaustion, the silence of the home thickened. The girl, barely a teenager, found herself the only woman inside those walls. The expectations shifted with chilling inevitability. In that family's eyes, her future had already been chosen. The mountains gave cover to these arrangements. Preachers didn't climb that high into the holler. School teachers stopped their visits after years of unanswered knocks. And the law? It was miles away, concerned only with the bigger towns where commerce flowed. Out there in the mist and shadows, no one questioned what a family might do to keep itself intact. No one asked how far tradition could bend before it snapped into something grotesque. But stories still leaked. Travelers passing through spoke of a girl with downcast eyes, wearing dresses too large for her small frame. They said she rarely spoke, as if words themselves had been taken from her. When asked about her, neighbors would shift uncomfortably and change the subject. It was easier to pretend she didn't exist than to confront what her existence implied. The cabin became a symbol of something unspeakable, its windows dark, its doors closed, the smoke from its chimney the only sign of life. And for those who dared to look too closely, the faintest echoes of a girl's voice carried through the trees at night. Was it laughter, or was it something else, something more like a cry? The truth remained sealed within those walls. But soon, the secret the family fought to keep would grow too large to hide, and the whispers in the hollow would turn into questions that no one dared answer, because a body can be hidden, but a pregnancy cannot. As seasons shifted across the ridges, the girl's body began to change. What started as faint signs, a pallor in her face, the slight swelling beneath her dress, soon became impossible to ignore. Yet instead of guiding hands or supportive whispers, her condition was met with absence. She stopped appearing in the school rosters. Her seat in church, once beside her mother, was left empty. In the spaces where her name should have been recorded, there was only silence. The family did not speak of her. To them, her body was not evidence of tragedy, but an extension of their customs. The men under that roof carried on with their lives as though nothing had shifted. To neighbors, it was harder to ignore. They caught fleeting glimpses of her when she ventured outside, her figure wrapped in oversized clothes, her face downcast, her arms clutching her stomach as though shielding it from the eyes that watched. Each sighting was brief, almost spectral, as if she herself was becoming a ghost within the community. Questions stirred in whispers at the general store and in the narrow pews of the church. But they were whispers only, never spoken aloud with conviction, because to question the father of the child was to confront a truth too grotesque to bear. Was it her father who had claimed her? An uncle? A cousin living under the same roof? The possibilities alone were enough to freeze the words in the throats of those who wondered. Instead, the community looked away. They told themselves it was not their place. In Appalachia's isolated hollers, where every family had secrets and survival depended on privacy, people rarely crossed boundaries. To pry into another household was to invite someone into your own, and so the girl's swelling figure was seen but not acknowledged. Her silence was mirrored by the silence of the hollow. The isolation pressed down heavier with each passing month. The girl's once rare appearances vanished entirely as her condition advanced. The cabin became her prison, its log walls closing tighter with every cry of her body. For her, there was no midwife, no doctor, no guiding voice to ease the terror of what was coming. The mountains in all their vastness were a cage, and inside she bore the weight of a child that no one would claim. Still, even silence has its cracks. On certain nights, when the wind shifted just right, neighbors claimed they heard faint sounds carrying down from the ridge. Not laughter, not song, but low cries, muffled sobs that drifted from the cabin like a confession no one wished to hear. Some said it was the girl herself, grieving a future stolen from her before it began. Others swore the cries belonged to something else entirely. A baby's voice, too early, too fragile, too haunting to belong in this world. The community chose not to ask. The family chose not to tell. And the girl, caught between the two, slipped deeper into a silence that suffocated more than the air inside that cabin. But silence can't last forever. One night the quiet broke, and when it did, the hollow would never forget the sound, because silence may protect secrets, but screams betray them. The night was heavy, the air thick with silence, broken only by the crackle of firewood and the anxious whispers of women gathered in a dimly lit room. Candles flickered against rotting wooden walls, shadows dancing like restless spirits. When the child finally emerged, a silence fell over the house, not the silence of peace but of dread. The midwife, hands trembling, lifted the infant into the weak lamplight. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. Its limbs were bent at unnatural angles, as though twisted by unseen hands before it had ever touched the earth. The eyes, hollow, glassy and unfocused, seemed older than the child itself, as if carrying the sins of generations past. The cries were faint, ragged, not the cry of a newborn demanding life, but of something already fading. No one spoke. No one dared. The mother, pale and drenched in sweat, reached out with trembling fingers, but even she recoiled at the sight of her own blood. Some whispered that the baby bore the mark of God's wrath, that it was a punishment for years of secrecy, for sins never spoken aloud but practiced in shadow. Others muttered that the child was no child at all, but a curse made flesh. What happened next has been retold in whispers for decades, each account darker than the last. Some swore the midwife wrapped the child in linen and carried it outside, burying it beneath the frozen earth before the sun ever rose, as though hiding the evidence of a family's shame. Others claimed it lingered for hours, gasping through the night, its fragile breaths echoing like a death rattle through the cabin. But there is one account that has survived, passed down by a neighbor who swore she saw what others tried to bury. She claimed the child lived, if only for a moment, long enough to prove what the community already feared, that the bloodline was poisoned. The eyes of the infant, she said, seemed to lock with hers, empty yet knowing. And in that gaze she saw not just the tragedy of one night, but the shadow of generations built on secrets, lies, and forbidden bonds. By dawn, the child was gone. No grave was marked. No record was kept. The family carried on as though nothing had happened, but the silence that followed was more haunting than any scream. The only trace of the child's existence lived in rumor, a ghost in memory, carried on the tongues of those who swore they had seen something unholy born under that roof. And yet, not everyone believed it ended there. Some say the baby was hidden, kept alive in secret, its presence locked away from prying eyes. Others whisper it was handed off, abandoned at the edge of the woods, left to vanish into the wilderness. No truth has ever been confirmed, but the uncertainty is perhaps more terrifying than the story itself. Because if the child truly lived, what became of it? By the time the baby was gone, the holler itself seemed to hum with unease. Neighbors who had once traded bread and borrowed tools now lingered at their windows, eyes narrowing, ears straining for scraps of truth. It wasn't the birth alone that unsettled them. It was the way the family tried to fold the night back into silence, as if nothing had happened. But silence never sits still for long in the Appalachian dark. It ripples, it spreads, and in this case it turned into whispers. Those whispers started small. A woman at the creek noticed the girl never walked alone, not even for water. A boy swore he heard crying at night that didn't sound like any child he knew. And then came the questions that no one dared ask aloud, questions about the men who lived under that sagging roof. Too many of them, some said. Brothers, cousins, a father, even a grandfather, all sharing one small cabin, all bound by blood. And at the center of it, always, was the girl. Her eyes gave her away more than her silence ever did. Wide, sunken, darting toward the ground whenever someone spoke her name. Children said she flinched when her uncle's hand rested on her shoulder. Others noticed she would not sit near her own father when supper tables were pushed together at community gatherings. Something about her body language told the story her lips would never speak. She was afraid, but fear was contagious, and it spread beyond her. Neighbors felt it too. To ask the wrong question was to invite danger. In the holler, families depended on one another for survival. Winter meant borrowed firewood, shared cornmeal, help with slaughtering hogs. To accuse someone of a crime so unspeakable, incest, was to risk tearing the fragile fabric of survival itself. So the whispers never grew louder than the trees. Still they gathered into patterns like smoke that eventually betrays the fire beneath it. If the baby was deformed, if its cries never lasted, if it vanished before the sun, then surely its father was not some stranger wandering through. It was someone inside that house, someone with the same last name. The question wasn't if the father was kin, but which one, and that question carried weight too heavy for anyone to lift. Was it the father, hard-faced and silent, whose temper had been whispered about before? Was it the older brother, always seen standing too close? Or was it another, one of the men who came and went, all bound by blood, all cloaked in secrecy? Each possibility was more horrifying than the last, and yet no one confronted them. Not the preacher, not the sheriff, not even the families who lived closest. Because in places like this, truth was more dangerous than ignorance. Silence could be lived with. Truth could kill, so the holler stayed quiet. But in that silence, the rumors deepened, curdling into legend. And like a sickness that spreads unseen, the story of that night began to infect everyone who heard it. A reminder that evil can live not just in shadows, but in plain sight. And the darkest part. The truth was still inside that house, waiting to be uncovered. In the holler, stories spread like smoke, impossible to catch but heavy enough to choke the air. And in those mountains, the story of the nameless baby became more than memory. It became legend. A child who had entered the world twisted, gasping and unwanted, only to vanish before dawn. Never claimed, never mourned, never spoken of except in whispers. Some said the baby was buried in shallow soil behind the cabin, beneath the reach of sunlight. Others swore it was taken to the woods and left for the earth to reclaim, its cries swallowed by the pines. A few believed the family had hidden the body inside the house itself, tucked away as if its existence had never been. No one knew which was true, but all agreed on one thing. The child belonged to no one. The family denied everything. They carried on with their lives, tight-lipped and defiant, daring anyone to ask too much. But the holler knew. The neighbors knew. Everyone could see the daughter's sunken eyes, the way her body bore the mark of what she had endured, the way silence was forced down her throat like a stone. And yet no one spoke aloud, because here in the Appalachians, to name the crime was to own it, and no one wanted that burden. So the child became what no family wanted to acknowledge, a ghost of their collective shame. Generations later, the legend still clings to the soil. Locals say that if you walk too close to the ruins of that cabin on a cold night, you might hear it, faint wails like a newborn's carried on the wind. Some claim they've followed the sound deep into the trees, only for it to vanish, leaving them alone with the creak of branches overhead. Others tell of dreams where the child appears, its hollow eyes staring, its twisted body crawling toward them. But the most unsettling part is not the ghost stories. It's the truth that fed them. A community so bound by secrecy, so dependent on silence, that it allowed an innocent life to be erased. The baby was not just a victim of bloodlines that should never have crossed. It was also a victim of a culture where family business excused every sin, no matter how grotesque. And that is why the wails still echo. Not because of spirits wandering the mountains, but because guilt never leaves the living. The holler chose silence over truth, survival over justice, and silence has a way of haunting those who keep it. The baby became a legend, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented, a sin carved so deep into the land that even time could not bury it. And though the child had no name, no grave, and no family to claim it, it remains the most enduring reminder of what happens when isolation twists love into possession, kinship into corruption, and family into a prison of blood. Even now, the mountains seem to whisper, and if you listen too closely, you may hear the cries of the child no one claimed. Her story lingers not just as rumor, but as warning. In those mountains, silence became stronger than truth. A child was erased, a family's sins buried, and a community chose denial over justice. It is easy to think of this as a relic of a darker past, but the truth is, silence still exists today, protecting secrets that should never be hidden. The mountains do not forget. Generations pass, cabins rot, names fade from ledgers, yet the echoes remain. A scream carried on the wind, the creak of a floorboard in an abandoned shack, the faint cry of a baby that never should have been born. These are not just ghost stories, they are echoes of real lives lost to the weight of secrecy. And that is why we tell these stories. Because when silence wins, history repeats itself. If this story unsettled you, remember, it is only one of many. America's forgotten corners are full of truths darker than fiction, waiting to be unearthed. Subscribe to Hidden Docs for more untold histories, because the shadows of the past still breathe, and the mountains may still hold secrets far more disturbing than this one.